We just bought a house for $42 million. Hearing these words from my mother-in-law, I was nothing but astounded. The father-in-law standing next to her seemed just as happy as she was. And this was right after just 1 month since the death of their son, John. The in-laws in front of me only seemed to think about themselves, and the bankbook held in my mother-in-law's hand was indeed John's. I thought to myself, if only they knew what that money was for, and I couldn't help but laugh. My condolences. The words that inadvertently came out of my mouth left my in-laws looking at me in confusion, not knowing how to react. It seems they wanted to see me explode in anger, but from my perspective, I could already see them being the ones enraged. I thought about telling them the truth right away, but decided to hold off for the moment. My name is Sherry, a 42-year-old part-timer. My routine involves working at a supermarket in the morning and taking care of household chores in the afternoon. I'm married, living with John. Unfortunately, we were not blessed with children, but after discussing it, we decided to enjoy our time together rather than pursuing parenthood. We met when John came to sell to the company where I worked. I was at the reception every time he visited, and gradually we started going out for meals and movies, deepening our relationship. After 3 years of dating, John proposed and we got married. Our greeting to my parents went very smoothly. They seemed eager for me to marry, bowing their heads and asking John to marry me as soon as he mentioned it. Caught off guard by my parents' reaction, I was speechless. But John, with a stern face, deeply bowed and said, "I am unworthy, but please accept my deepest respects." I was left speechless by this exchange, staring blankly for a while before managing to close my mouth. The atmosphere was very cordial, and we finished the greetings, relieved on our way home. Next, we had to greet John's parents, which did not go as well. Although they easily consented to our marriage, my mother-in-law began sizing me up as soon as I entered their house. She watched my every move, making me feel constantly under surveillance. Feeling the pressure, I was too tense to speak much. Thankfully, John did most of the talking, but even then, my mother-in-law kept scrutinizing me, and my father-in-law never took his eyes off me. By the time we left, I was utterly exhausted. I had hoped for a peaceful life after marriage, but it seems my in-laws had other plans. Frequently visiting our home despite our newlywed status. Despite not living nearby, they would spend time and travel costs to visit us on weekends. And with John often away for work, they took the opportunity to snoop around our house. After leaving my job and continuing as a part-time worker to take care of the house, I was always ready to welcome my in-laws. Every weekend, I found myself preparing for their visit. I would spend the entire day cleaning every corner of the house, from the entrance to the bathroom, kitchen, and living room, ensuring everything was spotless for their critical eyes. I also made sure to cook, thinking they might miss homemade food, going as far as to buy ingredients I didn't have. To be honest, dealing with my mother-in-law alone was quite troublesome, but visits from my father-in-law were equally challenging. They claimed to be checking if I was adequately supporting John. My mother-in-law saw it as her duty to point out any shortcomings as a wife, while my father-in-law was supposed to check for any inconveniences from a husband's perspective. Although my father-in-law rarely made demands, my mother-in-law was relentless. Her criticisms extended to unnecessary details like cleaning methods, adding seasonings, and even how to fold laundry, pushing me to the brink of a nervous breakdown. And as if that wasn't enough, they also relentlessly meddled in our decision not to have children. Being a wife isn't just about household chores, you know? It's about comforting your husband when he returns tired from work and striving for the prosperity of your descendants. Neglecting this duty makes you a failure as a wife. She always said this before leaving. Even my father-in-law, waiting outside, would nod in agreement. It seemed they weren't satisfied unless they had criticized me for something. After leaving such parting words, my mother-in-law would always slam the door on her way out. Once I confirmed the door was closed, I would sigh, listening to their footsteps fade away, which had become a routine sequence of events. I once protested to my in-laws, but they didn't listen at all. Instead, I was scolded fiercely and told never to speak of it again. Unable to protest directly, I reluctantly asked John to speak to them. After hearing my request, John, looking pale, apologized and immediately called his parents to protest. Thankfully, their visit stopped the following week. However, my relief was short-lived as they began calling us, not just on weekends, but also for long conversations that I found utterly draining. Since I only worked mornings at the supermarket, I was home in the afternoons, which my mother-in-law, knowing or not, took advantage of by calling me. The calls were about trivial matters, outings with friends, what they ate, complaints about neighbors, or even bad-mouthing my father-in-law, which I had to listen to endlessly. Occasionally, my father-in-law would call with bizarrely inappropriate content, which I'd rather not detail here. These lengthy phone calls became another source of frustration. Due to these long conversations with my in-laws, I was unable to go shopping for dinner, cutting into the time I had for household chores. While shopping after work could reduce the risk of running out of ingredients, it still severely limited my preparation time. Spending all day listening to my in-laws' unending stories meant I couldn't prepare dinner before John came home. I wanted to serve him a warm meal after his tiring day at work, but it was impossible to manage in time due to my in-laws' lengthy calls. John would laugh it off, saying he didn't mind, and he did express his frustration with his parents' behavior, especially being scolded by his mother. Well, it's only natural for parents to worry about their child. It must be Sherry making you say such things. Hand over the phone right now. This would often lead to secondary disasters, making it difficult to put an end to their behavior. Unlike their previous visits, my in-laws were relentless, causing us great distress. Then, as usual, just as I arrived home, the phone rang. Of course, it was my mother-in-law. You know, Sherry, my husband is planning to spend all his retirement money at once. The conversation seemed to start with complaints about my father-in-law today. Sighing quietly so my mother-in-law couldn't hear, I sat on the living room sofa, trying to tune her out, but then I heard something shocking from her. You're lucky, you know. After all, John seems to be making a good profit from stocks. And Sherry, you've smartly taken out life insurance on him. How commendable. What? Indeed, John was into stocks and had been making a decent profit, but how did my mother-in-law know about it? Especially life insurance, which we hadn't discussed with them. John started trading stocks, believing that relying solely on salaries from jobs or part-time work might not be enough in the future. He had managed to build up a significant asset since the beginning of the year. We decided to keep this a secret from his parents to avoid being taken advantage of, especially regarding life insurance. Somehow, they found out. "How do you know about that?" I couldn't help but reveal my feelings, to which my mother-in-law replied with a sneer. "Your father found it when we visited last time. Oh, and don't worry, it wasn't snooping around. He just wanted to check if John's room was clean, so forgive us, okay?" Her smug tone over the phone made me snap back. "Even if you were John's parents, do you think it's right to invade his privacy like that?" It's natural for parents to be concerned about their son, isn't it? Besides, knowing he has assets means we can rest easy about our retirement. He's such a good son. Hearing her genuinely pleased tone left me speechless. When I reported this to John upon his return from work, he was visibly distressed. "Can't believe they knew. That money was meant for us." Despite his concern, there was little we could do but resent their prying eyes. We spent many nights discussing how to protect our hard-earned assets from my in-laws. Then, suddenly, I received news that John had collapsed at work. I had just returned home from shopping and, as usual, found myself caught up in a phone call from my mother-in-law. Just as I was hoping the call would end, my smartphone rang. Thinking this was my chance to end the call with my mother-in-law, I mentioned the incoming call. However, she dismissed it, saying, "Who is it from? You shouldn't answer calls from unknown numbers, but listen, I was talking to the neighbor yesterday," and continued her story unfazed. Stunned, I missed the chance to end the call and glanced at my phone again, only to find the screen dark. As I listened to my mother-in-law, the phone rang again from the same number. Clearly, the same person was trying again. Despite not recognizing the number, I saw this as an opportunity to interrupt my mother-in-law's never-ending story. Lying that the call was from someone I knew, I finally managed to end the conversation with her. Answering the persistent phone call, I was informed by John's workplace that he had been urgently hospitalized. Rushing over in a panic, I found that John had already passed away. The cause was cancer, which had progressed rapidly. He had apparently been reluctant to visit the hospital. I learned from his colleagues that he had been deeply worried about me being mistreated by his parents during his absence and had wanted to return home quickly. Knowing this, I was engulfed in deep sorrow as his funeral was solemnly conducted. Despite their son's death, my in-laws didn't seem very grief-stricken. If anything, they appeared restless and distracted. Although their behavior was concerning, I prioritized handling the funeral arrangements. After the funeral and just 1 month's memorial service, which my in-laws did not attend, they visited. Reluctantly letting them in, they started boasting immediately without even paying respects to John. "We just bought a house for $42 million. I was dumbfounded by her words, and the father-in-law seemed just as pleased. It had been only 1 month since John's passing. The in-laws in front of me were only thinking about themselves. The bank book in my mother-in-law's hand was indeed John's. As I processed this, I couldn't help but laugh. Seeing me laugh, my in-laws looked puzzled. Nonetheless, my mother-in-law continued talking. "There was this house we always wanted, and after John passed away, we thought of buying it with the insurance money. We stole the bank book and seal right after the funeral and rushed to buy it." "My condolences." My response left my in-laws staring at me, unsure of how to react. They probably wanted to see me explode in anger, but I could only imagine them being the ones to rage. I considered telling them the truth right away, but decided to hold off. Their situation was clear to me, and I knew what was to come. I understood the action I needed to take, though I hesitated for a moment. Despite my disdain for my in-laws, they were still John's parents. I thought about forgiving them slightly for John's sake, but recalling their past actions made it impossible. Apologizing to John in my heart, I decided to firmly enact my retribution and began my counterattack. First, I pointed out the most obvious issue. Stealing a bankbook and seal from a house is a crime. Oh, did I not mention? This bankbook was given to us by our son. Don't make it sound like we stole it. Knowing his time was short, John gave it to us as his final wish. Their story had changed, but I decided to let it go for the moment. However, I realized if I didn't act quickly, they might try to push through their nonsensical claims. So I informed them that the insurance money would not be deposited into that account. Unfortunately, that account won't be moving anymore. Nonsense! It's in our son's name. Why wouldn't it work? Their confusion was evident, but they fundamentally misunderstood the situation. Indeed, the bank book held by my mother-in-law had John's name on it. That's precisely why the account would remain inactive. Without my intervention, it would stay that way indefinitely. A deceased person's account is frozen, and withdrawing from it requires extensive procedures. Fundamentally, as the insurance money's recipient, it wouldn't be deposited into John's account. Explaining this, my in-laws turned pale. Their cunning schemes were thwarted by their ignorance of how the world works, leaving me utterly astounded at their foolishness. And just so you know, the insurance money has already been deposited and it will never end up in your hands. With those final words, my in-laws' faces turned sour. My mother-in-law, glaring at me, shouted with a bite in her voice, "Even with John's huge inheritance, there's no need to be so stingy." Indeed, I had inherited entire $130 million estate. That was always the plan, and after my in-laws became aware of the assets and insurance money, John had told me so. Thinking back, John must have known about his health by then. Reflecting on this exchange fills me with sadness. It's just $50 million. Can't you just let it go? His insistence did nothing to sway me, so I reiterated what should have been obvious. That money originally belonged to John, and it's not up to me to give permission for it. Hearing this, my mother-in-law said something unthinkable for a mother. "He's gone now, so you can give permission in his place, right?" Her words made my blood boil. Before I could think to persuade them logically, I found myself raising my voice in response. "I cannot do that." For a moment, my loud voice made my in-laws freeze. But if they were going to change their ways, we wouldn't be in this situation. My father-in-law, coming to his senses, tried to persuade me. "Then what about the payment for the house?" "That's not my concern. Isn't what you're doing the real issue here?" "Don't be so cold. We're family." The word family made my temples twitch. If they were going to bring up family, what about all the times they mistreated me? Not just during my marriage with John, ever since we announced our marriage. Using the word family has only led to problems. I had hoped they would eventually accept me, but instead they treated even their own son, John, lightly, and I felt indignant. Realizing this, I stopped trying to be considerate. No matter how much I tried, it would never reach my in-laws. The moment I gave up, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, making it easier to speak my mind. Have you behaved in a way that deserves to be considered family? I threw their own words back at them, but my in-laws seemed uninterested in listening, only insisting on their selfish demands. We've taken care of you. Ever heard of the phrase unwanted favor? How rude to speak to your husband's parents like that. I grimaced at her accusation. I had tried not to show it, but my patience was wearing thin. I don't want to hear about rudeness from people who stole a bankbook and seal during their son's funeral and didn't even attend the memorial service. Despite my clear rejection, my in-laws showed no signs of backing down. Their desperation for John's money infuriated me. You married into the family, so it's only natural to take care of your in-laws, respect your elders. Have you done anything worthy of respect? I couldn't help but respond sharply. Honestly, I didn't feel very sorry. It would be generous of me not to say outright that they were the reason for John's downfall. Unaware of my feelings, my mother-in-law revealed yet another shocking fact. All right, we gave you pocket money before. We picked out things from your house that seemed unnecessary and sold them. But we gave you the money, so it counts, doesn't it? Realizing the truth behind the pocket money finally made sense to me. It was a bit before John had put a stop to his parents' visits. I remember receiving money from my mother-in-law, thinking it was a rare, kind gesture. I had no idea there was such a backstory to it. Indeed, I recall John frantically searching for his beloved camera, unaware it had already been sold. The shock that they turned his belongings into pocket money for me was profound. So that's why John's camera was missing. John was too busy to use it, so it was just clutter. Her justification seemed plausible, but the world would likely see it differently. That's essentially theft. At my assertion, my mother-in-law sighed in exasperation. You're just trying to paint us as criminals, aren't you? Her dismissive shrug infuriated me. I was the one who wanted to sigh in disbelief, yet she acted as if she was the aggrieved party, which only served to infuriate me more. How could my in-laws be so adept at provoking me? It was almost admirable in a twisted way. Because you are criminals. However, I knew that losing my temper would only complicate matters further, despite my efforts to remain composed. You can't prove that. Believing they could somehow justify their actions and escape blame, they continued their attempts. Realizing we were at an impasse, I decided to resort to my last option. Then let's have someone else judge this matter. Whether you agree with the judgment or not, it will be the correct one. Their brows furrowed in confusion, and after exchanging glances, they looked back at me, clueless. And who would you have judged this? I sighed dramatically for effect and laid out their options one by one. Would you prefer a lawyer? Or maybe the police? Hearing this, my in-laws' eyes widened in panic. There's no evidence. So how would they know it was us? Seemingly realizing the severity of the situation, my mother-in-law scrambled for excuses, but their attempts were futile. From the moment they stepped into my home, I had been prepared not to let them escape. Ever heard of smartphones? And there's this wonderful thing called a recording app. I pulled out the smartphone I had discreetly kept in my pocket and waved it in front of them, watching as the color drained from their faces. That's eavesdropping, she screeched. But unfortunately for her, the world doesn't consider this eavesdropping. From the moment they admitted to stealing the bankbook and seal to selling John's cherished camera without my knowledge, I had activated the recording app on my smartphone, capturing everything from the moment they sat down in my living room. Then, shall we include this in the police's judgment? Even if I told them this recording wasn't considered illegal eavesdropping, my mother-in-law would not back down. It was better to force them into a corner where they had no choice but to listen. As I began to prepare to leave, "Don't you feel sorry for my son?" Her words made me halt abruptly. Not that I felt no remorse towards John. On the contrary, the moment I decided to stand up to my in-laws, I was already burdened with guilt. But being coerced into feeling guiltier now wouldn't shake my resolve. "I'll return those words right back at you." In response to my retort, my mother-in-law flustered and insisted. "We were thinking of you." Interrupting her self-righteous claim, I took a moment to lay out the situation calmly. "So, your concern led to stealing John's bankbook and seal after he passed away, buying a house, and planning to cover the payments with John's insurance money? That's just hindsight." Whether it was my calm demeanor or my matter-of-fact tone that unnerved her, my mother-in-law attempted to counter, but I firmly cut through her defense. "No, it was a crime committed with your own decision." Seeing my determination, my mother-in-law took a defiant stance. Perhaps realizing there was no escape, she chose to confront the situation head-on. "If you're so eager to label us as criminals, let's go to the police and prove our innocence." With that declaration, she, along with my anxious father-in-law, attempted to storm out. I didn't stop them. Instead, I quickly readied myself and accompanied in-laws to the police station. At the police station, after explaining the basic situation, the officer, considering the complexity of the case, separated us into different rooms for a more detailed interrogation. I shared everything in detail from my marriage to the events of that day, and even played the exchange recorded on my app as evidence. Despite the noise from another room, I explained my story without distraction. As expected, my in-laws were suspects of theft and underwent further questioning. Their reluctance to speak truthfully prolonged the process, giving me enough time to file a complaint and search for a lawyer. Though I managed to return home that day, my in-laws apparently behaved so poorly towards the officers that they were arrested for obstructing official duties, thus acquiring a criminal record. But I wasn't ready to forgive them just yet. If I was to act, it had to be thorough, reflecting my resolve. By hiring a lawyer, I could consult properly and demand compensation from my in-laws for the mental distress and repayment of the money from items they sold without my permission, utilizing every possible measure. Consequently, my in-laws were overwhelmed by the payments due to me. Originally being a housewife, my mother-in-law was relying solely on my father-in-law's retirement fund, and they found their finances strained by my compensation. Additionally, the cancellation fees for the impulsively purchased house further burdened them. Despite reaching their 60s, they were forced to work multiple jobs to settle their dues, living quietly at home under the judgmental gaze of neighbors. Considering their financial turmoil, moving wasn't an option. As for me, I used the inheritance from John to move discreetly. The apartment we once shared felt too lonely after his passing, so I purchased a new condo. Though now a widow, I lived comfortably, honoring John's memory daily. Unable to ease my sorrow, I began crafting and selling small items, which unexpectedly became quite popular, leading to surprisingly busy days. This venture helped me make friends in the neighborhood. Occasionally, we'd share inspirations and advice over tea, enjoying each other's company. Unfortunately, I lacked the knowledge to repurchase John's cherished camera. Yet, I often revisited the photos he took, gazing out from the slightly too large living room of my condominium, imagining our life together. How happy we could have been together. Despite such impossible wishes, the photos of me smiling, taken by John, remind me to pursue happiness. While it may take time, I believe time will help me heal. Free from the troubles from my in-laws, I look forward to living peacefully.